Okay, so looking at dry brush with acrylic paint, start off with a completely dry brush. Use the smallest amount of paint on your brush and just wipe off onto your paint palette a fair bit of brush. So you've a fair bit of the paint, so you only have a small amount of the paint left. And then when you're applying it onto your paper, you see that because you have only a tiny amount of the paint left on your brush, it gives that dry look. So it's really good for texture. You can layer it with another colour, just taking off the excesses again. So it's really good just to have your paint palette next to yourself while you're painting, and to remove the excess paint from your brush before you start to paint, and then you create that dry brush look. For sgraffito, you want to apply a nice thick area of paint, and if you feel like it's very gluggy, you can put a small amount of water onto your brush, but you still want to have a nice thick layer. Again, you can still mix colours, and then using a mark making tool or a stick, or just the other end of your paintbrush, you can then draw into your paint and create your marks to create texture and lines. But you can see you can get a lot more detail than using the watercolour version of sgraffito. So wet in wet is traditionally a watercolour technique, but wet in wet can also work very much like watercolour, but using acrylic paint. So first up, wet your paper using a clean brush and water. So you can see I'm just adding clear water. And then I'm going to use my acrylic on my brush, and I'm going to drop it in, and you can see that it won't spread as far as watercolour, but it will still bleed into the paper. If I want to wet it further, if I wet my brush with the paint on it, I can really turn it right into watercolour and get the same effects as watercolour. Obviously it does dilute down the colour, and that's just by adding a lot more water to the paint. For overlay or glazing technique, what I'm going to do is lay down some darker colour first. And I'm going to let that dry, and then once it's dry, I'm going to be glazing over the top of it with a lighter colour. So with the overlay glazing, now that my darker colour is now dry, I'm going to go in with a lighter colour. So I'm going to use a bit of this red. Just going to put a bit of water into it. I can now go over the top, and as you can see, as the translucency, I'll go over the top. If I go a bit thicker, it's obviously still visible, but not as visible. But it will just depend on what choice of colours you use and the thickness of the paint. Okay, so for this one, modelling paste, I've also called it texture because it's sometimes known on the tub as texture paste or modelling paste, depending on the brand. This one's texture paste. It's kind of like toothpaste consistency, and you can use either a icy pole stick or a palette knife to apply it. So you scoop it out and you layer it on. So this is really good if you want to create like a relief effect, like a raised effect in your painting, to create not just implied texture, but actual texture in your painting. So and you'll find that, as I found this morning, different pots will have a different thickness of texture. This one's really thick. And so you can see a really thick area. At the moment it's just white on white. You can decide how smooth it goes on, or how kind of stippled how rough it is. And then leave that to dry before you start to paint it. So now the modelling paste or texture paste is dry, I can now apply my paint over the top of it. So I can either apply a little amount of paint so that it leaves areas of white, or if I go in with a much thicker approach, or if I also very gently dab with my paintbrush, which really I should use a pushing brush for something like that. I'm going to fill all those crevices, so I'm not going to see any of those white marks left behind, but it's going to still create that built up texture on the page. And so that's using modelling paste. To create some drips or splatters, what I can do is I need a bit of water on my brush so that it does fall. What I can do is I can tap. As you can see, there's no paint coming off it, which means it's too thick. So if I add a bit of water to it, I can then tap my brush to create some drips, some splatters. I can also load up my paintbrush or load up the top of my paper and tip the paper and then allow it to drip down. It does work a lot better doing this with watercolour than with, and you can see it will start to drip. And that technique is a lot better with watercolour, but again, if you water down your acrylic, it will act a lot like watercolour. We also have a splatter tray that we can use for creating some really fine mist splatters. So these are the splatter trays. The red and the silver ones are exactly the same, do the same job, so it doesn't matter which one you use. When you're using them, you want to apply a film of paint. It works the same with using acrylic or watercolour. Not too much paint, but just nice thin paint. And if you find it's not working, add a bit of water to it. You want to get nice and close to the paper, and then when you're blowing, it's like a puff of air, a bit like you're blowing out birthday candles. And that's the effect you're getting. You can build up lots of nice different colours together. You can also do white on top of black paper, works really well as well, but you can get that sort of fused look of a splatter. For the sponge effect, you want to just use a small sponge and dip it into your paint. If you have a really thick, goopy amount of paint, it's just going to blob down and it's not going to look very nice. It's not going to give you that sponge texture. So just pre-wipe that onto your paint palette first, so that you've really got hardly any paint on the surface of your sponge. And then you can just lightly sponge on. You can also twist as well, if you're really wanting to create a different kind of effect. And you can also layer with different. I'm just pre-wiping it on my paint palette again. You could also build up with some white onto that as well, and build layers of colours as well. But the idea is you want to have less paint so that it's creating that texture again. For masking, we use masking tape. We can cut or tear areas, so you can cut to divide up sections of your paper. Works really well if you're particularly wanting bold geometric kinds of shapes. Then you apply your paint over. And then very carefully pulling it up. Just got to be really careful as you pull it up, watching for paper tearing. It's very easy to do, especially when using just the normal cartridge paper. Watching also for your dirty fingers in that clean area. You want to aim to keep that clean area really pure white. Otherwise it spoils the look of that really clean geometric shape. Just really pulling it up really carefully, and that's your masking. Okay, so this one's soft edge versus hard edge. So it's just looking at the qualities of a line. So to do a soft edge, it refers back to the dry brush technique. So we're going to use just a dry brush that hasn't hit the water yet. I'm going to use my paint, acrylic paint, and really soften in. So it's got that sort of fuzzy edge line to it. And sometimes if you're painting and you don't want that sort of fuzziness, so you can see there, it's quite fuzzy edged. And then if we look at a hard edge, I'm going to really just wet my brush, make sure I've got a good balance between the amount of paint and the amount of water. And create a really nice clean cut line of my paint.